The summer breeze carried the sweet scent of hope as Mrs. Anderson finished packing the last suitcase into their pearl-white SUV. As a state senator, she'd spent months pushing through tough police reform bills, and now it was finally time for her family's much-needed vacation. Her husband stood in their driveway, checking the GPS route to Martha's Vineyard one last time, while their two kids playfully argued about who'd get control of the car's Bluetooth first. "Remember when we used to fight over the radio instead?" Her husband chuckled, closing the car's trunk with a satisfying thud. Their daughter rolled her eyes, already plugging in her carefully curated road trip playlist. Their son, the family's resident photographer, was busy adjusting his new camera, determined to document every moment of their annual getaway. The morning sun painted their suburban home in a warm glow as Mrs. Anderson took one final look at her email. 3 messages from her office about pending legislation could wait. This trip was about family. She'd earned this break after the grueling legislative session, fighting for changes that would make their communities safer for everyone. Did everyone remember their phone chargers this time? She called out, remembering last year's crisis when all their devices died halfway through the journey. A chorus of "Yes, Mom," echoed back, making her smile. It was these simple moments that reminded her why she worked so hard in the Senate, to build a better world for not just her children, but for all families. Their neighborhood was just waking up as they pulled out of the driveway. Weekend joggers waved hello, and Mrs. Anderson spotted their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, tending to her prize-winning roses. This was the America she believed in: peaceful, diverse, working together. As a black family who'd achieved their American dream, they knew both the possibilities and challenges their country held. "I checked the weather," her husband said, settling into the passenger seat while she took the first driving shift. Clear skies all the way to the coast. He'd taken time off from his law firm for this trip, something that was getting harder each year as his client list grew. But family traditions were sacred to them both. Their kids were already lost in their own worlds in the backseat, their daughter texting friends about their vacation plans, their son snapping photos of the sunrise through the car window. Mrs. Anderson glanced at them in the rearview mirror, her heart swelling with pride. Despite her busy schedule at the state capitol, they'd grown into thoughtful, confident teenagers who understood the importance of both their privileges and their responsibilities. The highway stretched out before them, nearly empty this early in the morning. Their SUV hummed quietly as they accelerated to cruising speed, the familiar rhythm of road trip conversations beginning to flow. They talked about everything and nothing: summer plans, college tours for their daughter next year, the new pizza place in town, and their son's upcoming photography exhibition at his school. Mrs. Anderson relaxed into her seat, one hand resting easily on the steering wheel. The tension of the legislative session began melting away with each mile marker they passed. She'd spent months arguing for accountability and justice, sitting through heated debates and pushing back against those who claimed reform wasn't necessary. But here, with her family heading toward the ocean, she could just be herself, not Senator Anderson, not the voice of reform, just a mom on vacation with the people she loved most. Little did they know that their perfect family getaway was about to become an unexpected test of everything she'd been fighting for in the Senate chambers. But for now, in these peaceful morning moments, they were simply happy, free, and together. The family had been on the road for about 3 hours when their daughter spotted a charming roadside diner. "Can we stop for breakfast?" she asked, and everyone agreed they could use a break. They enjoyed a peaceful meal, sharing plates of fluffy pancakes and crispy hash browns, completely unaware of what awaited them just a few miles ahead. Back on the highway, Mrs. Anderson's husband took over driving. Their SUV cruised smoothly in the right lane, maintaining perfect speed. The kids had dozed off in the backseat, their morning energy finally settling into that comfortable road trip quiet. Mrs. Anderson was reading through travel brochures about Martha's Vineyard when she noticed the police cruiser that had been following them for the past few minutes. "Honey," she said softly to her husband, not wanting to wake the kids. "Have you noticed that patrol car?" He checked his mirrors calmly, his hand steady at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. He'd been driving exactly at the speed limit. Their car was in perfect condition, and all their documentation was in order. Still, years of experience had taught them both to be extra careful in situations like this. The flash of blue lights filled their rearview mirror. Her husband signaled and pulled over smoothly, making sure to stop where their car would be visible to passing traffic. Mrs. Anderson felt her heart speed up, but kept her voice steady as she gently woke their children. "Everything's okay," she assured them, "just a routine stop." 2 officers approached their vehicle, one on each side, hands already resting on their weapons. Mrs. Anderson noticed how they seemed to tense up as they got closer to the car, despite the family's obvious vacation luggage and the professional appearance of everyone inside. Her husband rolled down his window, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel. "License and registration," the first officer demanded, not even bothering with a greeting. His flashlight beam swept across their faces, lingering longer than necessary. When her husband reached slowly for his wallet, the officer's hand tightened on his weapon. "Sir, I'm going to get my license from my wallet in my back pocket," her husband said clearly, using the careful tone he taught their son about police interactions. The second officer was peering through the back windows, making their children shrink into their seats. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer ordered suddenly. Mrs. Anderson felt her stomach drop. She knew the script all too well. It was exactly the kind of escalation she'd been fighting against in her legislative work. "Officer, may I ask why we're being asked to exit the vehicle?" her husband asked politely. "We were following all traffic laws." The response came sharp and hostile. "I said step out of the vehicle. All of you." Mrs. Anderson discreetly reached for her phone, remembering all the times she'd advised constituents about their rights during traffic stops. Their daughter whimpered softly in the backseat, and Mrs. Anderson wished she could shield her children from this moment. "This is a family vacation," Mrs. Anderson tried to explain, her voice calm but firm. "We're happy to provide any documentation you need." But the officers weren't listening. They called for backup, treating this peaceful family like a threat. As more patrol cars appeared on the horizon, Mrs. Anderson caught her husband's eye. They shared a look that carried years of shared experiences and understanding. They both knew that what happened next would either confirm everything they'd been fighting against or become an opportunity for real change. Their peaceful family vacation had suddenly transformed into something else entirely, a stark reminder of why Mrs. Anderson's work in the Senate was so crucial. But right now, she wasn't thinking about legislation or policy. She was thinking about protecting her family while documenting every moment of what was clearly about to become much more than a simple traffic stop. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing second. Mrs. Anderson watched through the rear window as 3 more patrol cars pulled up, their lights painting the peaceful morning highway in flashing red and blue. Her husband's hands remained steady on the steering wheel, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the careful control in his breathing. "Ma'am, put the phone down," one officer barked, noticing Mrs. Anderson's device. She kept recording but spoke calmly. "I have the right to document this interaction." Her years of legal experience steadied her voice even as her heart raced. Their daughter's hand found hers in the backseat, trembling slightly. Their son, always the quiet observer, sat perfectly still, his photographer's eye taking in every detail. The way the officers' badges caught the morning light, how their hands never strayed far from their weapons, the growing crowd of curious onlookers slowing down as they passed. "Step out of the vehicle now," the first officer repeated, his tone growing more aggressive. "The registration you provided doesn't match what's in our system." Mrs. Anderson knew this was impossible. Her husband had just renewed everything last month. She could see the valid registration sticker clearly displayed on their windshield. "Officer," her husband said, his voice remarkably composed, "I can show you the digital copy of our registration on my phone. Everything is in order." But before he could reach for his phone, both officers tensed up, drawing their weapons halfway. "Don't reach for anything," they shouted, causing their daughter to let out a frightened gasp. Mrs. Anderson felt her maternal instincts surge, wanting to protect her children from this trauma while knowing they needed to stay calm. "We're a family on vacation." Mrs. Anderson tried again, her senator's diplomatic skills kicking in. "Our children are in the car. There's no need for weapons." She kept her phone steady, recording everything while trying to comfort her kids with her presence. The morning had grown warmer, but inside the car, everyone felt a chill. More officers approached, their radios crackling with static and coded messages. Mrs. Anderson could hear them discussing the family's suspicious behavior, which apparently meant being well-dressed black people in an expensive car. Their son whispered, "Mom, I'm scared," and Mrs. Anderson felt her heart break. This was exactly what she'd been fighting against in the Senate. The moment when an ordinary family activity becomes a frightening confrontation simply because of skin color. "Show us proof of ownership for this vehicle," another officer demanded, ignoring the valid registration they'd already provided. Mrs. Anderson watched her husband reach very slowly for the glove compartment, narrating his movements. "I'm opening the glove compartment to get our insurance and purchase documents." The summer breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from nearby fields, such a peaceful backdrop to this increasingly tense situation. Mrs. Anderson thought about all the committee meetings where she'd shared stories like this, all the times some had dismissed her concerns about racial profiling. Now she was living it, with her own family, on what should have been a happy vacation morning. Their daughter, who had been learning about civil rights in school, whispered, "This isn't right, is it, Mom?" Mrs. Anderson squeezed her hand, trying to transform this scary moment into a teaching one, even as she continued recording. "No, honey, it's not right. But we're going to handle it the right way." The officers huddled together, discussing something in low voices. Mrs. Anderson could see them running their plates again, checking their documentation repeatedly as if hoping to find something, anything, to justify their aggressive response to a family on vacation. What started as a simple traffic stop had spiraled into a scene that would soon make headlines across the country. But right now, Mrs. Anderson wasn't thinking about headlines or viral videos. She was thinking about her children in the backseat, about her husband's dignity, about all the other families who faced situations like this without the protection of a senator's title, protection she couldn't even use yet, as these officers still had no idea who they pulled over. "I'm going to step out first," Mrs. Anderson's husband announced clearly, wanting to protect his family by handling the initial confrontation himself. As a corporate attorney, he knew exactly how to handle this situation, or at least he should have. But sometimes, even doing everything right isn't enough. The morning sun had risen higher now, making the officers' badges glint as they surrounded him the moment his feet touched the pavement. "Hands where we can see them," they commanded, though his hands had been visible the entire time. Mrs. Anderson kept recording, her phone steady despite her racing heart. "Officers, I'm a corporate attorney," her husband explained calmly, standing with dignified posture despite the hostile treatment. "We're on our way to Martha's Vineyard for a family vacation. I'm happy to show you all our documentation again." His voice remained steady, professional, the same voice he used in high-stakes courtroom negotiations. The lead officer cut him off. "Sure you are," he said with obvious disbelief. "And I suppose that's your car too." The sarcasm in his voice made their daughter sink lower in her seat. Mrs. Anderson watched as her husband, a man who had argued cases before the state Supreme Court, was being treated like a criminal for driving his own car. "Mom," their son whispered, his voice shaking, "they can't do this, right?" She squeezed his hand, trying to stay strong for her children while documenting everything. Years of working on police reform legislation had taught her the importance of evidence, but nothing had prepared her for seeing her own family endure this treatment. Suddenly, one of the officers grabbed her husband's arm, twisting it behind his back. "Stop resisting," they shouted, though he hadn't moved a muscle. Mrs. Anderson's heart jumped to her throat, but she forced herself to keep recording steadily. Their children's frightened gasps filled the car. "I am not resisting," her husband stated firmly, his lawyer's training evident in his careful choice of words. "I am complying with all your commands. There are children present. Please be professional." The morning traffic had slowed to a crawl as passing cars watched the scene unfold. Mrs. Anderson made a crucial decision. Still recording with one hand, she reached for her purse with the other, where her Senate ID waited like a trump card she wished she didn't have to play. Before she could retrieve it, another officer yanked open her car door. "Exit the vehicle," the officer demanded. Mrs. Anderson noticed his body camera was switched off. Another violation she'd fought against in her recent legislation. "My children are in the car," she said clearly, making sure her voice would be picked up by her phone's microphone. "They're minors. I request that you call a supervisor to the scene." The summer breeze carried distant highway sounds. Normal traffic, normal life continuing just yards away while their world had turned upside down. A bird sang somewhere nearby, the cheerful sound a stark contrast to the tense situation unfolding on the roadside. "I don't care who you request," the officer snapped. "Get out of the car now." Mrs. Anderson could see her husband being handcuffed, could hear her children's frightened breathing, could feel the weight of every second being recorded on her phone. This was no longer just about their family. This was evidence of everything she'd been fighting against in the Senate. As she prepared to exit the vehicle, she spoke clearly into her phone's recording. "I am complying with the officer's orders. The time is 10:47 a.m. My children are in the back seat. We have broken no laws." Her political training helped her remember these crucial details even as her mother's heart was breaking for her family. The confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn. One that would shake up not just the local police department, but would spark a nationwide conversation about racial profiling and police reform. But in that moment, Mrs. Anderson wasn't thinking about the political implications. She was thinking about her handcuffed husband, her frightened children, and the long fight for justice that had just become intensely personal. The next few moments felt like a scene from someone else's life. Mrs. Anderson stepped out of the car as commanded, her phone still recording, though now held down at her side. The hot pavement burned through her sandals. They dressed for a beach vacation, not a confrontation with law enforcement. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," barked an officer, his tone dripping with unnecessary aggression. Mrs. Anderson complied, but spoke clearly for her phone's microphone. "I'm a mother being handcuffed in front of my children. We've broken no laws." Their daughter's voice cracked from the backseat. "Please don't hurt my mom." The sound pierced Mrs. Anderson's heart, but she maintained her composure. Their son had begun quietly recording on his own phone, his hands trembling, but his camera steady, just like she taught him. "Look at them, acting all proper," one officer sneered to another, unaware of the multiple recordings capturing his words. "Bet this car's reported stolen by tomorrow." His partner laughed, adding, "Nice vacation story. Nobody's buying it." The cold metal of handcuffs bit into Mrs. Anderson's wrists as she watched another officer roughly handling her husband, who continued to maintain his dignity despite the humiliation. Their eyes met briefly, sharing a look that carried decades of shared experiences and silent understanding. "We need to get the kids out too," an officer announced, making Mrs. Anderson's stomach lurch. "No," she said firmly, her senator's authority bleeding into her voice. "They're minors. You need to contact Child Protective Services before removing minors from a vehicle." The lead officer turned to her, surprise flickering across his face at her knowledge of procedure. "Oh, we got ourselves a lawyer here too," he mocked, but Mrs. Anderson could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. Their son spoke up from the back seat, his voice stronger than anyone expected. "We're recording everything. Our mom taught us about our rights." Pride mixed with worry in Mrs. Anderson's chest. proud of her children's courage, but worried about potential retaliation from the increasingly agitated officers. More patrol cars arrived, lights flashing, creating an unnecessary spectacle. Passers-by had begun parking along the shoulder, holding up their phones. Mrs. Anderson knew the scene would soon be viral, but her immediate concern was for her family's safety. "Check the trunk," ordered one officer, "and run their IDs again." Mrs. Anderson watched as they roughly handled their vacation luggage, tossing aside beach toys and summer clothes. Her husband's carefully packed laptop bag was dumped onto the hot pavement, his legal documents scattered by the wind. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as they stood handcuffed by their car, watched by a growing crowd of strangers. Their children remained in the backseat, holding hands, their young faces pressed against the window, witnessing something no child should have to see. "You people think you can just drive around in cars like this," muttered an officer as he roughly searched through Mrs. Anderson's purse. Her Senate ID was right there, but he tossed it aside without a glance, more interested in finding something to justify their treatment. Mrs. Anderson thought about all the times she'd sat in committee meetings, listening to testimony about similar incidents. Now here she was, living what she'd fought so hard to prevent. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so painful. "I want to see a supervisor," she repeated, her voice carrying the authority of years in public service. "And I want my children protected." She could see her husband wincing as the handcuffs dug into his wrists, but his head remained high, his lawyer's mind no doubt cataloging every violation of procedure. The scene had escalated far beyond a simple traffic stop, becoming instead a perfect example of everything wrong with the system. But a revelation was coming, one that would turn this humiliating moment into a catalyst for change. The officers' smug expressions would soon fade when they realized exactly who they had handcuffed on the side of the highway. The police station buzzed with typical morning activity when the officers brought in the Anderson family. Their vacation luggage was still scattered across their car on the highway, but that was the least of their concerns now. The children walked close to their mother, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. "Process them separately," the arresting officer commanded, still carrying himself with unearned authority. Just then, the station's front door swung open, and the police captain walked in, returning from his morning coffee run. He stopped mid-step, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. "Senator Anderson." The captain's voice cut through the station's noise like a knife. The arresting officers froze. One of them actually dropped his notepad. "What in God's name is going on here?" The same officers who had been so aggressive just minutes ago suddenly couldn't move fast enough to remove the handcuffs. Mrs. Anderson stood tall, her wrists red from the too tight restraints, and met the captain's shocked gaze. "Captain Reynolds," she said calmly, though her voice carried the weight of every moment of their ordeal. "I believe we met last month during the Police Reform Committee hearing." The blood drained from the arresting officers' faces as realization dawned. Their son, still holding his phone with shaking hands, had captured everything. The officers' racist comments, their aggressive behavior, the illegal search, all of it recorded in crystal clear detail. Now, watching these same officers stumble over themselves to explain, he understood exactly why his mother had always emphasized the importance of documentation. "Ma'am, Senator," one officer stuttered, his earlier swagger completely evaporated. There must be some mistake. His partner was frantically flipping through their paperwork, perhaps hoping the ground would open up and swallow him whole. The police captain's face had turned a dangerous shade of red. "In my office. Now." His command sent the officers scurrying like scolded children. He turned to Mrs. Anderson, his expression a mix of horror and embarrassment. "Senator, I cannot begin to express." Mrs. Anderson raised her hand, her diplomatic skills taking over despite her anger. "Captain, right now I'm not here as a senator. I'm here as a mother whose children just watched their parents being handcuffed and humiliated for driving while black." Their daughter, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Mom, Is this why you're always working late at the Capitol? To stop things like this. The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Several other officers in the station looked away, shame evident on their faces. The captain was already on his phone, calling the chief of police. Around them, the station had gone eerily quiet. Officers who had been processing paperwork or chatting by the water cooler now stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. Your car is being brought here immediately, the captain assured them, his hand covering his phone's microphone. And your belongings. Mrs. Anderson's husband, straightening his suit jacket with dignity, stepped forward. We'll be needing copies of all body camera footage, he stated firmly, his legal training evident in every word. Though I noticed several officers had their cameras turned off, in direct violation of state law. He didn't need to mention that his wife had helped write that law. The arresting officers, waiting outside the captain's office, looked like they were about to be sick. Their earlier comments about these people and stolen cars were probably replaying in their minds. Everything they'd said and done was documented, not just by the family's phones, but by nearby traffic cameras and the videos already spreading across social media. A young desk surgeon approached with coffee and water for the family, her hands trembling slightly as she set the drinks down. Senator Anderson, she said quietly, my mother attended your speech last month about accountability in law enforcement. She'd be horrified to know this happened in our department. Mrs. Anderson looked at her children, then her husband, then back at the captain. Well, she said, her voice carrying the same strength she brought to the Senate floor, let's make sure this becomes a teaching moment for every department across our state. The morning had started with the family heading to their vacation. Now it was about to become a watershed moment in the ongoing fight for police reform. All because some officers hadn't bothered to run a complete check on the family they were harassing. The videos hit social media before the Anderson family even left the police station. Their son's steady camera work, combined with his mother's clear voice stating their rights, created a powerful narrative that was impossible to ignore. Within hours, the clips had been shared thousands of times. Breaking news. State senator and family racially profiled during traffic stop. The headlines screamed across every major network. Mrs. Anderson's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. Calls from fellow senators, civil rights leaders, and reporters from across the country. Their daughter sat in the hotel room they'd booked for the night, scrolling through her social media feed with wide eyes. Mom, you're trending, she said softly. People are so angry about what happened to us. The family had decided to pause their vacation plans, realizing this moment was too important to ignore. The morning news shows couldn't get enough of the story. State senator who authored police reform bill becomes victim of exact behavior she fought against. One anchor announced. The dashboard camera footage had been released, showing every moment of the baseless stop and aggressive treatment. Your phone recording was perfect, honey, Mrs. Anderson told her son, who was watching the coverage with a mix of pride and disbelief. His steady documentation of the incident was being praised by civil rights attorneys across the country as a textbook example of how to record police interactions. Their father's law firm had released a statement supporting the family, and his corporate clients were flooding him with messages of support. But it was the responses from ordinary people that touched them the most. Thousands of messages sharing similar experiences, thanking them for speaking up. Look at this, their daughter called out, showing them her tablet. A peaceful protest had formed outside the police station where they'd been taken. People held signs reading "Support Senator Anderson's reforms" and "Stop racial profiling." The crowd was diverse, united in their demand for change. Mrs. Anderson's colleagues in the Senate were calling for emergency sessions to fast-track her police reform bills. The same legislators who had dragged their feet on reform were now scrambling to show their support. The incident had put a prominent face on an issue that some had tried to pretend didn't exist. The family watched together as political commentators dissected every moment of the incident. The officers' comments about the car being stolen. One analyst pointed out, reveal deeply ingrained biases. They saw a black family in a luxury vehicle and immediately assumed criminal activity. Their daughter looked up from her phone again. "Dad, people are sharing your quote from the station." His calm statement about wanting to drive his children to vacation without fear had resonated deeply with parents across the country. It was being repeated on every news channel. Mrs. Anderson sat down to write a statement, her family gathering around to help. They didn't want this to be just another viral moment. They wanted real change. "We need to talk about what happened to us," she said, "but more importantly, we need to talk about what happens to families who don't have my title to protect them." The police department's initial response, a weak statement about investigating the incident, was torn apart on social media. Body camera footage from the officers who had remembered to keep their cameras on showed them mocking the family's vacation story, their bias clear for everyone to see. Civil rights organizations were calling the incident a perfect example of why reform was needed. When a state senator isn't safe from racial profiling, one leader pointed out, "How can any family feel secure?" The story had struck a nerve, forcing people who had previously ignored such issues to pay attention. The family decided to order dinner to their hotel room, still processing the day's events. As they ate, they watched more coverage unfold on TV. Their son's quiet voice broke through the news anchor's commentary. "Do you think this will actually change anything, Mom?" Mrs. Anderson looked at her family, her husband still dignified despite the day's humiliation, her children stronger for having stood up for their rights, and felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just a viral moment or a political opportunity. This was a chance to turn their traumatic experience into meaningful change for every family who might face the same situation. 3 days after the incident, Mrs. Anderson stood at a podium outside the state capitol. Her family stood behind her, their presence a powerful reminder of what was at stake. The crowd before them included journalists, activists, and countless citizens who'd shown up to show support. "What happened to my family wasn't just about us," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "It's about every family who's ever been pulled over for the crime of being black in America. The only difference is that I have a title that forced them to listen." Inside the police department, things were moving quickly. The chief of police had called an emergency press conference that morning, announcing the immediate suspension of all officers involved in the incident. Their body camera footage, or suspicious lack thereof, had sealed their fate. "Mom," their daughter whispered during a family dinner that evening, "my friends say their parents are finally talking about these issues at home." Mrs. Anderson squeezed her hand, recognizing how their personal trauma was creating ripples of change throughout their community. The internal affairs investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. The suspended officers had a history of similar incidents, but previous complaints had been buried or ignored. Now, with national attention focused on their department, everything was coming to light. Their son had been invited to speak at his school about the importance of knowing your rights and documenting police interactions. His video had become a teaching tool for civil rights organizations across the country. "I was scared," he told his classmates, "but I remembered what my mom taught us about staying calm and recording everything." The police captain, true to his word, had launched a comprehensive review of departmental practices. Mrs. Anderson's office received an official report detailing years of biased policing that had gone unchecked. The numbers were damning. Minority drivers were being stopped at rates far higher than white drivers, often with no valid reason given. "Your wife's bills suddenly had a lot more support," one of her husband's law partners commented during a meeting. Indeed, legislators who had previously dismissed police reform as unnecessary were now co-sponsoring her proposals. Nothing changed minds quite like watching a respected colleague endure blatant discrimination. The officers involved faced disciplinary hearings where their own recorded words came back to haunt them. Their casual racism, caught on camera and in their patrol car recordings, left no room for denial. "I didn't mean it like that" fell flat when confronted with clear evidence. Their daughter's social studies teacher used the incident as part of a lesson on civil rights and modern-day activism. Sometimes, the teacher explained, it takes one clear example to open people's eyes to what's been happening all along. Mrs. Anderson received an unexpected call from a police academy instructor. "We want to use your family's experience in our training," he explained, "to show future officers exactly what not to do and why biased policing hurts everyone." She agreed, on the condition that the training program be expanded to address systemic racism more comprehensively. The officers were ultimately fired, their termination letters citing multiple violations of department policy and state law. But Mrs. Anderson pushed for more than just individual accountability. She demanded department-wide reforms, including mandatory bias training and stricter enforcement of body camera policies. Their family's vacation photos never made it to social media that summer. Instead, their story became something more important, a catalyst for change. Other families began coming forward with similar experiences, knowing they would finally be heard. "We could have stayed quiet," Mrs. Anderson told a reporter who asked why they chose to push for reforms. "We could have accepted their apologies and gone on with our lives. But then nothing would change, and the next family might not be so lucky to have a senator's title to protect them." The department's new policies included mandatory reviews of all traffic stop data, looking for patterns of bias. Officers would need to clearly state their reason for stops, and supervisors would review body camera footage regularly. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. 6 months after that fateful traffic stop, Mrs. Anderson stood in the governor's office, watching as her expanded police reform bill was signed into law. Her family stood proudly beside her, their presence a reminder of the personal journey that had led to this moment. The Anderson Act, as people had started calling it, went far beyond her original proposals. It mandated body cameras that couldn't be turned off during encounters, required quarterly bias training, and established civilian oversight boards with real power to investigate complaints. "Remember when we just wanted to go to the beach?" their daughter said that evening, making everyone laugh despite the serious moment. They had finally taken that vacation, 3 months late, but with a new appreciation for their platform and purpose. Their son had turned his experience into action, starting a student group that taught young people about their rights during police encounters. "Knowledge is power," he told his members, echoing his mother's words. "And your phone camera is your witness." The changes spread beyond their state. Police departments across the country began adopting what they called the Anderson Standards, comprehensive guidelines for traffic stops that emphasized respect, clear communication, and accountability. Mrs. Anderson received invitations to speak nationwide, sharing their story to promote change. "Your mom's making history," their father told the kids one evening, watching her on national news. "But more importantly, she's making things safer for everyone's children." The pride in his voice reflected the family's journey from victims to advocates. The Police Academy's new training program included a powerful segment: dashboard camera footage from their stop, followed by body camera footage from recent stops done right. New officers learned to check their biases, to treat every citizen with respect, to remember that each car they pulled over contained someone's family. Their daughter's school project on civil rights now included a personal story. "My family's experience taught me that change is possible," she wrote, "but it takes courage to stand up and speak out." Her teacher shared the essay with other classes as an example of modern-day activism. Community meetings, once sparsely attended, now overflowed with citizens eager to work with police on building trust. Mrs. Anderson made sure to attend when she could, reminding everyone that progress happened through partnership, not division. The officers who'd stopped them that day had found new careers. One even reached out to apologize, admitting that the incident had forced him to confront his own biases. "Your family changed me," he wrote. "I'm sorry it took this to open my eyes." During a family dinner, almost a year after the incident, their son asked a question that made everyone pause. "Do you think things are really different now?" Mrs. Anderson looked at her family, considering her answer carefully. "Change happens slowly," she replied. "But it does happen. Every officer who thinks twice before making assumptions, every department that enforces its body camera policy, every citizen who knows their rights, that's real change." The Anderson family's vacation photos now hung on their wall, not from the trip they'd planned, but from the one they eventually took. Next to them hung framed newspaper headlines about the reforms their experience had sparked. It was a daily reminder that purpose sometimes found you, even when you weren't looking for it. Their story became part of training materials, textbooks, and civil rights discussions. But more importantly, it became part of a larger conversation about what kind of society they wanted to build. Other families began speaking up, knowing their voices would be heard. Mrs. Anderson's office kept track of the changes. Traffic stops down by 30%, civilian complaints reduced by half, and a new generation of officers trained to serve their whole community. But her favorite number was 0, the number of families who'd faced similar discrimination in their department since the reforms took effect. "We didn't choose this fight," she often said in her speeches, "but we chose to make it matter." And as she looked at her family, strong and united through it all, she knew they'd chosen right. Their interrupted vacation had become something far more important, a journey toward justice that would help families for generations to come.